Hi everyone, I'm Chris, and I'm appearing at the corner of your screen today because we're going to be talking about the political compass. There you go. Okay. As I said in my first video about the right wing, my background is in so-called political science. I used to think of myself as a critical thinker when really I just didn't know enough about my subjects to think critically about them. I could think about the possible problems with a given president's speech at the time or come up with arguments against something that someone else was for, playing devil's advocate. But that's not enough to appreciate the underlying flaws in the political economic system. I was still pretty ignorant. I am still pretty ignorant. I'm learning and unlearning every day. I like to go really deep into the subjects that I study so that I can keep learning more and more about them. I see how much I don't know, right? And most people don't usually, or at least they don't go deep into the same subject as I do. So the things I say on this channel tend to surprise, shock, and then just be dismissed by most people. In this series of videos, what I'll be doing is explaining modern politics, how I think, how a lot of other people think, by introducing the political compass. So let's take a look here. You may have seen it before. In fact, you might have seen various people or groups or ideas expressed somewhere on this graph. The first thing you should probably know about the political compass, in the name of critical thinking, is it's not a precise way of explaining how people think. And in my opinion, whatever people say, it's okay to hold two contrary opinions at the same time, as long as you're aware that they're in conflict. You don't always have to choose. But I also think we should try to strive for truth or accuracy if it's possible. So, you can look at the two axes here. You've got the authoritarian versus libertarian axis, and the economic left, economic right. I don't know if those are necessarily accurate because that axis isn't just about economic systems. There's a lot more to it, and I'll get into it in a couple of minutes. So the higher one finds oneself on this axis, on this authoritarian libertarian axis, then the more that person considers it legitimate that a small group holds power over everyone else. You might say the world itself is pretty authoritarian now, as power is concentrated in the hands of a few kings, presidents, a few really high-up bureaucrats, and probably even more importantly, a few billionaires who have access to any politicians they want around the world. Most people have been indoctrinated to believe that that's how it should be. It's the norm, and so it's not to be questioned. That's how the world works, kid. Well, I don't think it needs to. And what's the use of throwing up your hands and giving up when things could be better? Let's consider some of the effects of all authoritarianism, whether left, right, or anywhere else. It necessarily means a class system where a small minority have power over everyone else. Wouldn't you rather make your own decisions about things like what kind of things you can and can't do, what you can eat, drink, smoke, whom you can have sex with, access to health care, education for your children, and how the product of your labor gets used? Well, under an authoritarian system of almost any kind, you don't have those choices. Someone else gets to decide for you what is right and wrong, legal and illegal, and decides on the punishments for all the illegal things. So we have people getting locked in cages because they sell a nearly harmless plant. Is that the kind of world you want to live in? Because it's the world we've got. Things could be more authoritarian, though, like they are in some places, like in some totalitarian state where there are spies and snitches all around. So you wouldn't even be free to speak online like this without the fear you'd be arrested and tortured. So I guess wherever I live is, let's say, about here. Here you would see that this is pretty much the status quo in North America, around this area. Some people might be surprised. They might think it should be right in the center. Some people actually say that we have like a socialist economy or socialist government or something like that. I think if so, they're using very uncommon definitions of these words. It's very much a capitalist economy, and so that, and for reasons I'll explain soon, I'll get to, that's more to the right, and so we'll see them, it's more on the right here. And of course, it's quite authoritarian, because again, power and wealth are quite concentrated. So that would be quite high up here, too. We could even say it's around here, but maybe a bit lower. It's hard to say exactly. Anyway, going back to this axis, the up-down axis, I think freedom, I value freedom as a great way to achieve humanity's potential. You know, we would have better economies, more free time, less fear and stress, more opportunities to do what we actually wanted to do, rather than being forced into an economy where we can only do those jobs for which people with money willingly give us money. And working for an economy that has long since been owned and plundered by the ruling class. And potential or any reason, I see no good reason that a few people, whether kings, police, prison guards, or whoever they are, should have absolute power over the bodies of regular people like us. Unless, I suppose, that's your kink. Well, that's fine. When people start realizing they don't know what's best for other people, that people can generally figure out things for themselves, when they start caring about true justice instead of punishment, caring about other people's freedom as well as their own, they're ready to start moving away from the status quo, which again is somewhere around here, and start moving downwards toward what it says is the libertarian side of things. Libertarian. Don't get too confused or too hung up on this word. It has quite a long history. It used to mean the libertarian left, so the people in the bottom left over here. But in the US nowadays, it tends to mean the libertarian right, and so people over here. And it's also kind of been co-opted by people in the top right up here to quite an extent. And so even a lot of people who call themselves libertarians are actually kind of authoritarian. Really, if people truly believe in freedom at all, they can be found down here somewhere. Their idea of what freedom means depends where they are on the left-right axis. The terms right and left wing come from the relative seating arrangements in the Parliament during the French Revolution. The right represented the royals, the aristocracy, and the clergy, and the left was the commoners. As the capitalists began to take over from the Ancien regime, they became the right wing, and the working class, to the extent that it had class consciousness, was of course on the left. Now, in civics classes, you've probably learned something along these lines. However accurate it was is anyone's guess. You probably heard the words liberals, conservatives, radicals, and reactionaries. That's often what's taught in this kind of class. I think most people think they understand those words, or at least have a kind of gut reaction to them, but in my experience, most people don't. Now, I can say where these terms are supposedly on this political compass, but first, not everyone who identifies with one of these labels agrees with everything they're supposed to think, which is good. People shouldn't just believe whatever the herd believes. And second, it's hard to say exactly what these terms mean nowadays, as there seem to be more than one perspective on the subject, unsurprisingly, and since politics and the culture itself they're always changing, like everything, the meanings of these words vary from time to time and place to place. However, I think the definitions I'm going to give are pretty accurate. Let's take liberals. The word liberal has a few meanings, a few definitions, some of them which overlap. It really depends where you are, who you're talking to. If you're in a political science classroom, liberal might mean generally favoring liberty, because, of course, those words liberal, liberty are linked in historically. But also probably not straying too far from the status quo. You might talk about liberal internationalists who think if more states in the interstate system okay something, or maybe go through the UN or NATO, that makes it more legitimate. And they're sometimes contrasted with nationalists, supposedly more right-wing, who say, let's just go it alone. But when you're talking about domestic politics in the US, the word has something of a different history. About 100 years ago, the word liberal began to define the people who were anywhere left of conservatives, or what conservatives have now become known as. These words have become inextricably linked to the extent that they define each other by saying what they're not. I'm a conservative because I'm not a liberal, and vice versa. But, of course, they do have a lot in common. Both of them believe in the capitalist state, though they have somewhat different opinions on the powers that it should have. And, of course, as a compromise, the state takes the powers liberals think it should have and the powers conservatives think it should have. So it's got all those powers. And the people who own the state are just fine with that. Both liberals and conservatives believe in police, prisons, and punishment, though liberals tend to prefer, a bit less and, reform of those things every so often, which tends to get watered down so much that it doesn't really mean anything. Both of them believe in voting as one of the only legitimate ways of trying to change things, but they expect the people that they vote for to say different things while they're running for office. You may have noticed both of these groups support the status quo, just with minor modifications that they consider the basis of entire political identities. So liberals might be, again, if the status quo is around here, then liberals will be perhaps on the left side of it. But that doesn't mean that they're left-wing. Conservatives might be a bit on the right, and as some studies and my own observations show, a lot of them are much higher up here, quite authoritarian in outlook. Then you've got the words radical and reactionary. So remember I said liberals don't stray too far from the status quo. Well, if they did, they'd be radicals. Radicals much more left-wing than liberal. And so it's strange to hear when occasionally people talk about radicals on the right, or they're against all kinds of radicalism or something. If they're right-wing, they're not radicals. They're reactionaries. Radicals want radical change. They want to flatten social hierarchies, or at least destroy the existing ones, and empower the people. Reactionaries want power to remain in the hands of the few. presumably because they think that they benefit from that arrangement somehow. When you listen to reactionary political opinions, you hear that a lot of them are just fine with violence as long as it's used on the wrong people, such as people accused of a crime, leftists, people of the wrong race or religion, etc. Radicals might be okay with killing, but only, again, for the sake of radical change. They might joke about guillotines for those really rich people who hold our lives and our freedom in their hands, but unlike reactionaries, they're not out there killing. At least not yet. So if we look for them, we might find radicals to be much further to the left. Most of this area, all of the libertarian left and the authoritarian left, maybe. Some of them can be quite reactionary, though, in at least in opinion. A lot of people aren't just in one place on this political compass, and that's why it's good not to put too much stock into it. To say, I'm exactly here or exactly there. But then what if you have another belief or something like that? Let's look at the basic differences now between left and right. So in very, very basically or broadly, the left believes that people should be treated equally and have roughly equal social power. The top left would probably say that the top left, so authoritarian and, as it says, economic left, they would probably say that redistributing wealth and at the same time social power should be done and maintained by authoritarian means. So again, that means violence. Of course, they would say that it's warranted because it's a system of violence that's in place right now. And that's how people are able to get rich and hold power over each other. So I can at least understand and sympathize with that thinking, if nothing else. Whereas the bottom left, down here, they would probably say that the ideal is to permanently eliminate the structures of power and authority because those are the root of the problem. I've found myself in different parts of this compass before. In the past 15 years, I've had several different opinions. I think I started, basically a liberal. I mean, growing up in Canada, this is simply the status quo, that you have certain basic assumptions about politics and economics that don't even go questioned. I started reading more that kind of pushed me downwards and a bit to the right in some ways, but I kept kind of going downwards. That was the main thing, and I went down and sort of out into the bottom right corner. But and that's when I actually wrote a book when I was down there, and it was an okay book, but now I kind of disagree with at least half of the things that I wrote in that book, because since then I've done a lot of reading of anarchists, and I read about market anarchism, for example, which might be somewhere near the kind of this bottom center around here somewhere. I read about things like mutualism and anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism. Those things are way down here, right in the bottom left. So I've been to all these different places, and I'll be talking all about the left in my next video. So if you've only got the basics so far, don't worry about it. When we're talking about the right, people on the right tend, of course I'm speaking very generally, people on the right basically believe that people deserve to be treated differently, and that it's inevitable that different people will have different amounts of wealth and power. The right would say that inequalities in society are natural, or perhaps exacerbated by existing systems, but still inevitable. The reason I disagree, and I don't think like that, at least not anymore, is when you've read enough history, you can see social inequality is the result of specific actions people have taken, usually using violence to appropriate another person's labor. Until about 7,000 years ago, societies everywhere were egalitarian. It's the default state of humanity. The reason they no longer are is a few people violently imposed slavery, and then on top of that slavery, kingdoms, empires, and states on them, and on us to this day, creating classes of haves and have-nots, and inventing myths and belief systems to justify the violent social orders that they benefit from. Right-wingers tend to still believe a lot of those myths are unbreakable facts. For example, some of them might believe people get rich because they work harder, or create more value by some objective measure, and thus just deserve what they have. But I always ask how they got rich. Where did they get that wealth from? Did they destroy the environment and turn it into money? Did they make their money off the backs of a desperate workforce? Did they charge people money to live in a place? How much did they benefit from laws, subsidies, state-brokered business deals or father-brokered business deals, favorable interest rates, economies of scale driving competition out of business, intellectual property of some kind, having a monopoly maybe? Who knows? How much did they inherit? That's a huge source of people's wealth nowadays. And where did that money come from? People on the bottom right, where I was for 1 or 2 years, I think, they might think that rich people deserve the wealth that they have, but not the political power that comes with it. The problem is that a lot of people who are down in the bottom right, they still find ways to justify the current system through kind of almost mistaking it for their libertarian ideal. Because what we have really isn't a libertarian ideal, and you can't judge the wealth of somebody who got it through this system of violence in the same way that they could get it in the libertarian or so-called anarcho-capitalist ideal. But that's something, that's a topic for another video for sure. As people go further up the compass, and I'm not entirely sure why this is, but it just seems to be the people who are already on this side of things. As they go up further, you might hear them talking about IQ and sometimes pseudo-scientific arguments from biology, as if one group's superiority and dominance were perfectly natural and not the result of thousands of years of history. And if they get high enough, maybe way up here somewhere, they tend to be more okay with using any amount of violence to maintain social hierarchies, or put in an even more reactionary one, and for some reason, I don't really understand why, more likely to care about race. So race becomes a part of the myths that they spread to justify their love of violence and power. It's impossible to know what percentage of these people actually believe the things they say and what percentage just say it. But when we're talking about the top right, we're talking about some of the most ignorant people being led by some of the most vicious people. Truth, justice, other things I value are not in their interest. Which is, of course, why they spend so much time demonizing leftists. Leftists are the only ones who take a principled stand against them. Way up there, top right up there, that's where you'll find the people called the alt-right. And that's a term coined by a neo-Nazi, so I feel fine in using it as a term of abuse. To clarify a bit, I'll quote from Alexander Reed Ross, who wrote a book called Against the Fascist Creep, and who you can find on Facebook and Twitter. This is what he said. I think it was a Facebook status. Quote, "Here's why I call them the alt-right instead of just Nazis. The alt-right is a composite of a number of far-right tendencies, including anarcho-capitalists, Silicon Valley neo-reactionaries, MRAs, that's men's rights activists, which really just means anti-feminists, Klansmen, and other forms of fascists. Broadly, it's a fascist movement, but it's a fascist movement of a certain character. Calling them the alt-right makes a clear descriptive identification specific and shows that this is a discrete group, or rather a group of groups, with a set of visible, self-proclaimed, and established leaders." So I think that's it's a good description of who the alt-right is. And again, these are the people who dominate the top right, the people up here, who dominate that area of political thought in the present day. Alexander could have added to that many American conservatives approximate the alt-right position. They might have started around near the status quo, but at least in recent years, if not for 100 years, fascists, they know that conservatives are easily manipulated by feeding their prejudices. And so they do so through like right-wing Facebook pages and Breitbart and stuff like that. So they can, they're pushing them further up, further to the right. And that's why fascism is becoming so popular, I suppose, because people are not fact-checking, they're just sharing things that confirm their prejudices. You may have heard also of the libertarian to alt-right pipeline that people sometimes talk about. Really, it's mostly right libertarian. Again, when in the United States, when we talk about libertarian, we really mean right libertarian most of the time, unless someone calls themselves a left libertarian. But at the same time, even left libertarians, some of them have become alt-right too. It seems, it's less of a pipeline. Anyone can change their minds, but still, it's still a worrying trend. There are several possible reasons why right libertarians might have joined the alt-right. One of them seems to, you can read about this in articles and watch videos and stuff. Libertarian to alt-right pipeline are fine keywords for that. There seem to be a lot of reasons why, but one of them, it seems to be that racists have convinced libertarians that only white people appreciate or can be taught to appreciate freedom. It really does seem to, because that's their argument nowadays. They seem to have embraced Hans Hermann Hoppe's ideas about physical removal. Hans Hermann Hoppe, you might find him way to the right, and he says he's kind of bottom right, but again, he talks about physical removal. The idea is it's removing anybody who they say doesn't believe in freedom. But really, in practice, that's just anybody to the left of them, plus Muslims, plus anyone from a different culture, and anyone who's not white, basically. I think you're going to hear a lot about anti-communism and, anti-socialism or anti-Antifa in the years to come, because a lot of people on the right label all of those to their left communists and think they all need to be wiped out. So racists, white supremacists, white nationalists, and Nazis are right-wing and way up here in the authoritarian right, especially. It doesn't matter that the word Nationalsozialists had the word socialist in it, they weren't socialists by any but the most right-wing, bottom-right definitions. Socialists are on the left. They see people as equally worthy of life and freedom and respect. The reactionaries of the alt-right don't see people as equal, but see racism, competition, war, and everything else that goes with those things as natural, inevitable, even beneficial. Others on the right might not care about race or even be anti-racist, while nonetheless believing people will inevitably have varying degrees of power and seeing no inherent problem with that. Well, I do have a problem with that. And I'll be explaining why in my next video. Thanks, everyone.